So I need to start by telling you something that's going to sound small, almost embarrassingly small, given everything that happened afterward. This entire story, every single bit of it, started over tomatoes. Specifically, 11 tomato plants, and a man named Greg who, as far as I can tell, has never once in his life considered the possibility that other people's property might matter to him the same way his own does. I'm going to tell you this whole thing properly, start to finish, because honestly, the ending still makes me laugh a little when I think about it, even though the middle part made me genuinely furious in a way I didn't expect a garden to make me feel. Let's go back to the beginning. I'd moved into this house about 2 years before any of this happened. Modest little place, nothing fancy, but it had a backyard that got incredible afternoon sun, and that mattered to me more than almost anything else about the property when I bought it. I'd grown up watching my grandmother garden. Tomatoes, peppers, this stubborn little rosemary bush that somehow survived 3 different winters it had no business surviving. When I finally had my own yard, building a garden felt like, I don't know, completing something, connecting to that part of my life again. So over those 2 years, I'd built it up slowly. Raised beds, a small drip irrigation system I'd installed myself after watching probably 40 YouTube tutorials, and by the spring this story takes place, 11 tomato plants that were genuinely, objectively, the best tomatoes I had ever grown. Heirloom varieties, the kind you can't really get at a grocery store, the kind that taste like something instead of just being red and round. I was proud of that garden in a way that's a little hard to explain if you've never grown something from a seed and watched it become food. It wasn't just plants. It was kind of a small, quiet accomplishment that was entirely mine. And then Greg moved in next door. Greg was, and I want to be fair here because this story is going to make him look bad and he earns every bit of it, but Greg was not a subtle person. He drove a truck that was loud in a way that felt intentional. He mowed his lawn at 7 in the morning on Saturdays like it was a competitive sport. And within about 3 weeks of moving in, he'd already had 2 separate run-ins with other neighbors about his trash cans being left out on the wrong days. None of that really affected me directly though. Loud truck, early lawn mowing, trash can drama. Annoying, sure, but not my business. What became my business was his dog. Greg had this enormous dog, a mix of something and something else. Genuinely a sweet animal, honestly. Not the dog's fault at all, what I'm about to tell you. But Greg did not believe in fences for his own yard. And he definitely did not believe in leashes. And his solution to this was to just let the dog roam free across what he seemed to think was his entire block. The first time the dog wandered through my garden, it knocked over 2 tomato cages and trampled 1 plant pretty badly. I found Greg in his driveway that evening and mentioned it. Friendly, no big deal, just hey, your dog got into my garden. Might want to keep an eye on that. He laughed. Actually laughed, this short little dismissive laugh, and said something like, yeah, he does that. He's a good boy though. Like that was somehow an answer to what I'd just told him. I should have known right then exactly what kind of person I was dealing with, but I didn't, not yet. I just thought, okay, weird response, but maybe he'll keep a better eye on the dog now. He did not. Over the next 6 weeks, the dog got into my garden 4 more times, each time doing a little more damage than the last. By the 5th incident, I'd lost 3 more plants entirely, and had several others bent and damaged badly enough that they probably weren't going to produce much that season. I went over again, this time slightly less friendly, slightly more direct. I told him I needed him to either fence his yard or keep the dog on a leash, because this was genuinely costing me real money and real time, months of work undone in a few minutes each time. And this is the moment that I think really set everything else in motion. Because Greg didn't apologize. He didn't even pretend to take it seriously. He stood there on his driveway, arms crossed, and told me that I was being, and I'm using his actual words here because I've never forgotten them, way too sensitive about some plants. Some plants? I want you to understand I wasn't asking him to do anything difficult. A leash. That's it. That's the entire ask. and he looked at me like I was the unreasonable one for asking. I went home that night, and I sat in my kitchen for a while, just thinking, and I made a decision that, looking back, was probably the first real turning point of this whole story. I wasn't going to ask Greg for anything again. Whatever happened next, I was going to handle differently. So here's where I need to back up a little bit and tell you something I hadn't really paid attention to before any of this happened. Because it ends up mattering enormously later. Our neighborhood has a homeowners association. I know, HOAs have a reputation. And a lot of the time, that reputation is earned. Petty rules about mailbox colors, fights over fence heights, all of that. I'd honestly mostly ignored ours since moving in. Paid the dues, never been to a meeting, barely remembered the rules existed. But Greg's comment that night, way too sensitive about some plants, kept sitting with me in this irritating way. And at some point, scrolling through my phone unable to sleep, I ended up on our HOA's website, just kind of idly looking through the community guidelines document. I think I was looking for something about pets and fencing requirements, honestly, just trying to see if there was actually a rule I could point to. There was. Pets were required to be leashed or contained within the owner's property at all times. Clear as anything. Page 4 of the guidelines. But that's not actually what caught my attention as I kept reading. Because once I started actually reading the full document properly, for the first time in 2 years of living there, I realized just how much I'd never bothered to look at. Property maintenance standards, structural modification approval requirements, parking regulations, landscaping rules, page after page of things that, frankly, most of the neighborhood was probably casually ignoring, myself included if I'm honest. I closed my laptop that night without doing anything with the information yet, but something had shifted. I had a tool now. I just didn't know yet how much I was going to need it. The dog incident that finally broke something in me happened about 10 days later. I'd planted a second round of seedlings to replace what had been destroyed, smaller plants, less established, more fragile. I came home from work on a Wednesday and found nearly the entire bed flattened. Not just knocked over this time, actually flattened, like the dog had basically used the whole bed as a place to roll around. I stood there in my backyard for a long moment, just looking at it. Months of replanting work, gone in what was probably 90 seconds of an unsupervised dog having a good time. And then I heard it, laughing. I looked up, and Greg was standing at his back fence, phone in hand, and he was laughing while watching his dog trot away from my destroyed garden bed. He saw me looking at him, and instead of looking even slightly embarrassed, he called out, completely cheerfully, "Guess he really doesn't like your tomatoes, huh?" I didn't say anything back. I just turned around and went inside. But something had finalized itself in that exact moment. I wasn't angry in the loud, want to confront someone way anymore. I was angry in the much quieter, much more dangerous way. The way where you stop reacting and you start planning. So I want to walk you through exactly what I did over the next several weeks, because I think the structure of it is honestly the most satisfying part of this whole story. First thing I did was document the dog incidents properly. I went back through my phone and found I actually already had photos from 2 of the earlier incidents, taken mostly just to show Greg what had happened, but suddenly useful for an entirely different purpose. I added dates, times, descriptions to each one, built an actual little file. Then I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA about the leash violation, not a casual email, an actual formal complaint through their proper channel, attaching my photos and a clear description of 5 separate documented incidents over about 7 weeks. That alone probably would have gotten Greg a warning letter, maybe a small fine eventually. Mildly satisfying, sure, but honestly not enough given how dismissive he'd been about something that genuinely mattered to me. So I kept going. Because here's the thing about people like Greg. The people who treat rules as things that only apply to other people. They very rarely follow just one rule selectively. If someone doesn't care enough to leash a dog after being asked directly, multiple times, by an actual neighbor standing in front of them, what are the odds they're following every other rule in that HOA document properly? I started walking past his house more deliberately, not snooping exactly, just actually looking, the way you look at something when you're paying attention instead of just glancing past it on your way to your car. And once I started actually looking, I genuinely could not believe what I started seeing. The first thing I noticed was the fence. Greg had put up a 6-foot privacy fence section along part of his side yard about 4 months earlier. I remembered him mentioning it casually at some point. Our HOA guidelines, which I now had practically memorized at this point, capped side yard fencing at 4 feet without specific written board approval. I checked the HOA's approval records, which are technically public to residents on request. No approval on file for Greg's fence. That was violation number 1. Then there was the shed. A storage shed in his backyard, visible from the small gap between our properties, that I genuinely never paid attention to before. Structures over a certain square footage required approval too. I measured it, as best I could from a respectful distance, using a method that's honestly a little embarrassing to admit, which was comparing it against the known width of his fence panels. It was over the threshold. No approval on file for that either. Violation number 2. Once I had 2, I started actually walking the development. Not just looking at Greg's house, the whole community, because I needed to understand what normal compliance even looked like before I could be confident about what wasn't. And then, almost by accident, I found the parking issue. Greg had a second vehicle, an old work truck he used for some side projects, that had been parked on the street, not in his driveway, for what neighbors later confirmed had been close to a year. Our HOA guidelines explicitly prohibited overnight street parking for anything beyond 72 hours without a permit. Violation number 3, and this one had apparently been going on for months in plain sight of literally everyone on the block, with nobody bothering to report it because, frankly, most people don't want to be that neighbor. I was no longer most people. Over about 3 weeks, very quietly, very methodically, documenting everything with photos, dates, and specific HOA code references I'd now read so many times I could practically recite them. I built out a complete and genuinely shocking picture of Greg's compliance situation. The unleashed dog, the unapproved fence, the unapproved shed, the chronic street parking violation. But also, once I started really looking, things kept surfacing. An exterior paint color that didn't match anything on the approved palette. A detached basketball hoop installation that exceeded height restrictions. Holiday lighting from the previous winter that, according to a very specific and frankly slightly absurd clause in our guidelines, was supposed to be removed within 30 days of the relevant holiday, and was still, in late spring, very much still up. By the time I finished my full walkthrough documentation, going property line to property line, checking every single guideline against what I could actually observe, I had a list. 23 separate documented violations. I sat at my kitchen table the night I finished compiling it all into a single organized document, and I genuinely laughed out loud, alone, in my kitchen, because the sheer number of it felt almost cartoonish. 23. From a man who told me I was being too sensitive about some plants. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I didn't submit all 23 violations anonymously and just walk away satisfied. That's not actually how I wanted this to go. I went and knocked on Greg's door. I brought the folder with me, the full documentation, 23 items, organized exactly the way I'd present it to the HOA if I chose to. And I told him calmly that I had submitted the leash complaint already, that it was already in process, and that I had documented 22 additional violations on his property that I had not yet submitted. I watched his face change in a way that, I'll be honest, I had been looking forward to since that night he called my garden some plants. He asked, somewhat less confidently than usual, what I wanted. And here's the thing, I didn't actually want money from him. I didn't want him fined into oblivion or forced to move. even though at certain points during those angry weeks, I'd absolutely fantasized about exactly that. What I told him was simple. Fix the dog situation permanently. Actual fencing or an actual consistent leash policy. No more excuses. Replace what had been destroyed in my garden, which at this point was a meaningfully significant amount of plants and soil amendment and time, and handle his own compliance situation with the HOA proactively, on his own terms, before I submitted anything. I told him I'd give him 30 days. I want to tell you honestly that I genuinely didn't know which way this was going to go. Greg had shown me pretty clearly up to that point that he didn't respond well to being told what to do. But 23 documented violations is a very different kind of pressure than one neighbor complaining about a dog, because the HOA in our community, like most HOAs, has the ability to issue escalating fines for unresolved violations. And with that many simultaneous issues, we were talking about a number that would have added up fast, on top of forced removal of unapproved structures at his own expense. Greg fixed the fence situation within the first week, getting retroactive approval for a reduced height. He took down the shed entirely, rather than try to get it approved, which honestly surprised me. The truck disappeared from the street within 4 days, presumably to wherever he'd been avoiding parking it for whatever reason in the first place. And the dog got an actual fence, a real one, installed within 2 weeks, fully enclosing his backyard. He also, somewhat sheepishly, showed up at my door near the end of that 30-day window with a check that covered what I told him was a fair estimate of the garden damage and labor across all those incidents. I hadn't actually expected that part. I think honestly, once he'd been forced to confront just how much of his life had been quietly out of compliance, something in him recalibrated a little. Not into a different person exactly. Greg's still loud, still mows at 7 on Saturdays. But the casual disregard, at least toward me and my garden, completely stopped. Here's what I think about now, looking back at this whole thing. Greg looked at a person standing in his driveway, politely asking him to leash his dog, and decided that person, that situation, that request, simply didn't matter enough to take seriously. He laughed at my garden because in his mind, I was someone he didn't need to worry about, someone whose boundaries were optional. What he didn't account for was that being dismissed doesn't make people give up. Sometimes, it just makes them pay closer attention. I wasn't trying to ruin Greg's life. I genuinely wasn't. I just stopped accepting that my garden, my time, my actual stated boundary mattered less than his convenience. And once I stopped accepting that, I found I had more leverage available to me than either of us had realized. 23 violations were never really about the violations. They were about the fact that respect, once you ask for it directly and get laughed at instead, sometimes has to be built through other means. My tomatoes came back the next season. By the way, better than ever actually. Funny how that works. That's karma filed. Real frustration, real patience, real results. If this one got you, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the bell, because there's more of these waiting. I'll see you in the next one.